What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to some more tips and tricks, this time for both the EOS R5 and the R5C combined into one video. We are talking about fine aperture adjustments in this video, and both of those camera platforms do support this. So before I get into the details, a quick disclaimer, although it's a little bit longer than the normal disclaimer that I use. In the case of the Aperture 8th stop increments setting on the EOS R5, this setting is also available on all of the other EOS R cameras from the EOS R to the EOS R3, including the entry-level EOS RP. That said, I own and shoot with an EOS R5, and that's where I've tested this and what I've used for demonstration. Now, I have very good reason to believe that the functionality of the setting is going to be the same on all of the other other EOS R cameras, but I'm making this disclaimer just in case you run across something on one of those other cameras that's a little bit different from what I'm talking about here based on my experience with the R5. Now, the second point disclaimer applies to the fine increment setting that is found on the EOS R5C. Again, looking at all of the manuals for all of the other Canon cinema cameras, this setting is supported on all of the other cinema cameras, so the C300s, 500s, 700, 200, 100, etc. However, again, I own and use the EOS R5C. That is the only camera that I have access to test these things with. So while the setting is there and it should behave similarly, there will be some differences on the other cameras due to the lens and lens mount and so on and so forth. Which actually brings me to one other disclaimer. Part of this functionality is software based in the camera. The other part of this functionality is the lens that you are actually using. So EF lenses, RF lenses, and potentially PL lenses with servo adjustable apertures on a cinema camera will all have different capabilities based on the specific lens and type. So what I show is going to be different if what I show with an RF lens will be different if you're using an EF lens, and so on and so forth. So I've got 4 broad topics in this video. As always, there are chapter markers set for each of the sections, so if you want to skip a section that's not relevant to you, by all means go ahead, although there are some good comparative points in there. So we will start by talking about the availability and purpose of these settings, then we will talk about actually setting the fine aperture adjustments on both the EOS R5 and R5C, and then I will wrap up with some recommendations for what you might want to use. So to start with, why a fine aperture adjustment and what do you want is it good for? The short on this is it appears that Canon has just provided this because the lenses are capable of doing that. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, internally, Canon's EF and RF lenses do not actually stop down in the same aperture steps that your camera displays and works at. So you're probably used to seeing a display on the camera in either 1/3 or 1/2 stop aperture increments. However, internally, the lenses use smaller steps. In the case of EF lenses, they use 1/8 stop steps, and in the case of RF lenses, they use much, much finer than 1/8 stop steps, somewhere in the range of a 24th or possibly even a 32nd of a stop. Now, what this means is that, of course, the people who are calculating depth of field out to 10 decimal points and acting like they really have a huge reliance on this kind of minutiae information, if they're using 1/3 or 1/2 or 2/3 stop increments for Canon cameras, and in fact this actually applies to a lot of other camera brands as well, the lenses are actually stopping down to 3/8 and 5/8 and not 1/3 and 2/3 respectively. Now, of course, this means that there's an error. The error is a 24th of a stop, and the EF, or at least in the case of EF lenses, RF lenses can actually get much closer. In fact, I think they can be pretty much spot on. But the short of it is this error, it just doesn't matter. Either for depth of field or for exposure case, the exposure case. A 24th of a stop is a minuscule amount of variance. It's way, way, way within the range of correction. In fact, it's way within the range that you probably will never even see it to even need to correct it. So why, when, and how do you want to use this? Well, first of all, This setting is only available in movie shooting. So on the EOS R5, you have to be in movie mode, or well, in both cameras. In the EOS R5C, you have to have the camera set to video mode where you can shoot video using the Cinema OS. The point, obviously, is to provide finer control over the exposure with the aperture. Of course, when you're shooting video, your shutter speed and ISO are fairly limited, and the fact that because we have lower bit depths in our files, so 8 or 10 bits typically, 12 in the case of RAW, you have less latitude for exposure errors, and this would allow you to more precisely correct the exposure or set the exposure in camera when you need to fine-tune it. Now, where and why might you use this? Well, obviously one place is in matching exposure settings on very, very high-end productions. So if you're doing a Hollywood blockbuster, you might actually need to have sub-third stop aperture adjustments, especially if you're trying to match a still lens and f-stops with a cinema lens and t-stops, and that doesn't actually translate quite perfectly. Another example, and this is a bit more contrived maybe, is if you're shooting with a teleprompter and you need to adjust for the exposure that you have metered with a handheld meter. Now, of course, if you're shooting in a studio, you could just adjust the lighting up to compensate, but if you're shooting outside, that's not really an option. So to expand that example a little bit, I shoot with a teleprompter with a 70-30 beam splitter. A 70-30 beam splitter means that you have just over a half stop loss in light getting to the lens through the beam splitter glass, which means that you have to compensate for that. Now, if I have my camera set to 8th stop steps, I have a better ability to set the correct setting in what I'm doing, in that I could have, say, 4/8 or 7/8 or something like that of a stop instead of just 1/3 and 2/3 of a stop. So let's take a look at setting up the Aperture 8th stop increment setting on the EOS R5. So you will find this setting in movie shooting mode, so you have to have the camera in movie shooting mode to start with, under the Shoot To menu, under the AV 1/8 stop increment setting. And you will have two options there, enable and disable. Now, there are some limitations and some things that this changes when you enable it on your camera. So the first thing is limitations. This only works with RF lenses. If you are shooting with EF lenses, for whatever reason, you will not have the ability to use 8th stop increments. You will be stuck in either 1/3 or 1/2 stop increments based on the setting in your camera customization page. I don't quite understand why Canon chose to impose this limitation, considering that the RF lenses EF lenses internally use 8th stop steps, so they should be perfectly fine for doing this. And in fact, on the cinema cameras, this is what ends up happening. Now, the second point is that you are actually using 8th stop steps. Even though RF lenses support a much finer aperture increment, the camera will not use that finer aperture increment. It uses 8th stop increments. Now, the best part on the R5 of this whole process is that when you enable the Aperture 8th stop increment setting, the camera will change how it displays the aperture in the viewfinder and on the top LCD. Specifically, instead of displaying the 2/3 or half stop increments, it will display the increment as a whole stop with a n/8 increment next to it. So instead of the usual kind of like f2.8, f3.2, f3.5, f4 that you would be used to seeing in third stops, it will say f2.8 plus 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and so forth, and then it will become f4. So that's what you can expect to see there. Now, let's move over to the R5C and talk about the fine increment setting on the Cinema EOS OS that camera uses. Basically, it does the same thing. You will find it in the menus on the camera setup #1 menu page under Fine Increment, and again, you will only have enable or disable as your options. Now, the Cinema EOS OS provides some better options and some maybe not so better options or limitations when the camera is set to this. So to start with, the Cinema EOS OS will provide fine aperture steps for both EF and RF lenses. That said, when you have fine increments enabled, the camera will use the smallest aperture increment that is available on the attached lens. So in the case of EF lenses, this will be 1/8 stop increments, and on the case of RF lenses, this will be much finer. Now, I keep saying much finer and not really elaborating on that specifically, and that is because of the big limitation on the R5C. So on the R5C, when you enable fine increments, it does not change the user interface to display the fine increment in the aperture setting. Instead, the camera will continue to display the aperture value in either 1/3 or 1/2 stop increments based on what you have set the camera's aperture increment to, and it will round the setting, the fine setting that it's actually set to the closest full configured aperture, closest 1/3 or 1/2 stop step. Now this, of course, makes it incredibly difficult to determine just how many steps there are between in a given aperture setting or between aperture settings when using RF lenses. In counting, I came up with numbers between either like a 24 and like 30 or 32 steps, depending on how I tried to count things. I'm just not confident in what exactly that number should be, although 24th does make a lot of sense considering that's an even multiple for both thirds and halves. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about my thoughts and recommendations on this. Now, quite honestly, my thought on the fine increment setting in the EOS R5C is that I just don't like it at all. I appreciate that Canon is using the finest aperture step that the lens supports, and I appreciate that RF lenses have incredibly fine aperture steps because it makes it incredibly nice for the lens to smoothly step between aperture settings while recording video. However, exposing 24 to 30 steps per stop makes it incredibly frustrating to change settings. It's like you're scrolling for days to get to another stop. On top of that, the R5C's poor user interface, where it doesn't actually tell you what you're set to, it just rounds it to the nearest 1/3 or 1/2 stop, makes it difficult to actually know where you are. So you have tons of steps, especially with RF lenses, and then you have a user interface that doesn't really give you fine information about what you're doing. Now, the R5 does this arguably way better. Unfortunately, the downside is the camera won't do it with EF lenses, which I would like to have, even though it's probably less of an issue going forward. But the fact that it provides the exact 8th stop information step that you're at in the user interface makes it really easy to know exactly where you are and where you're going. And on top of that, by and large, the 8th stop increment really, I think, is a more useful range. 24 or 30 steps per stop makes it like turning the wheel for days to get to the next setting. 8's not that bad, and the difference between any given setting is fairly small. So from a fixing the exposure type perspective, it's kind of a good balance, whereas, you know, ultimately, obviously, internally, it's not a bad deal to have a way smaller aperture step to have finer adjustments in aperture changes. So for recommendations, it comes down to this. I don't use it. I find that exposures in the 3rd stop increments are more than sufficient for my uses and most applications that I ever see happening with the camera. On top of that, the implementation on the R5C, where I might be most inclined to use it because I have that camera behind a teleprompter most of the time, is so fine for RF lenses that it's more frustration than actual utility in my experience. But in short, I just don't see a whole lot of value in this setting. Now that said, I did want to cover it because I'm sure there are people who have seen it and said, what's that? Why would I want to use it? And what is its capabilities? And of course, there may actually be some people out there who really need to use this for one reason or another. In fact, if you are one of those people that absolutely rely on the fine aperture increments either in the R5 or the R5C, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what your use case is. So if you found this video useful or at least a bit interesting, let me know by hitting that thumbs up button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.